Chapter 26, The West and the World. So in this chapter, we're basically going to be looking at the events leading up to World War I. Industrialization and the world economy, the opening of China, new imperialism, the Great Migration, the scramble for Africa, and all of that will bring us up to 1914. Industrialization and the world economy. And we're starting with the rise of global inequality. And so at the peak of its power and its pride, the West entered this dynamic phase of expansion that had begun as far back as the Crusades and continued with the great discoveries and the rise of seaborne colonial empires. And the areas that were industrialized in the 19th century, mainly in Europe and North America, increased their wealth and power enormously, which opened up a gap between those who were industrialized and those nations that were not industrialized, or third world regions, mainly Latin America, Asia, and in Africa. And this sort of became institutionalized or built into the structure of the world economy. And in these third world places before 1913, the income per person stagnated. And so there was a rise in income disparities. And this isn't just a disparity in income, but also in food and clothing and healthcare and education, even life expectancy and just general material well-being. And so this has generated a lot of debate. And there's one school of interpretation that says that the West used science and technology and capitalism to create wealth and greater physical well-being. And there's another school of interpretation that says that the West used its political and economic power to steal its riches. But this is a debate that's still being continued even today. So in the 19th century, Great Britain took the lead in cultivating export markets for its incredible industrial output. And European nations and the United States began to put protective tariffs into place so that they could protect their own industry, their domestic industry. And again, tariffs are put on imports to protect goods that were produced in the home country. And so the British manufacturers aggressively sought and found other foreign markets for their goods in non-Western areas. And, as a British colony, India couldn't raise tariffs to protect its ancient cotton textile industry. And as a result, thousands of Indian weavers lost their livelihoods. And Britain, they remained the world's largest importer of goods, even with the protective tariffs. Almost like the world's emporium, where manufactured goods, agricultural products, raw materials entered freely. And so free access to Britain's market stimulated the development of mines and plantations in many non-Western areas. So international trade also grew as transportation systems improved. You've got the railroads, which drastically cut transportation costs, opening up new economic opportunities, allowing for people with new sets of skills and attitudes to be employed. Not to mention the power of steam revolutionized sea transportation as well. And passenger and freight rates were reduced, which made intercontinental shipping of low-priced raw materials feasible. And not to mention the opening of the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal, which was shortened global transport time. And so these new communication systems directed the flow of goods across global networks. And so this also brought around, rapid communication. You have the transoceanic telegraph cables that allowed people to communicate, especially among the financial centers of the world. And as the economies grew in Europe, Europeans began to make massive foreign investments, with 3/4 of the exported capital going to other European countries. I'll show you the U.S. and Canada, Australia, New Zealand. But Europe found, its most profitable opportunities for investment in the construction of railroads and ports and utilities that were necessary to develop lands in places like Australia. Much of this investment was good. Most of it was mutually beneficial for the lenders and the borrowers. The victims in these cases were the Native Americans, the Australian Aborigines, those natives who were decimated by disease, liquor, weapons of an aggressively expanding Western society. The opening of China. So early on, China's trade with Europe was carefully regulated by the Chinese government. And the Qing dynasty required all foreign merchants to live in the southern port of Canton and to buy and sell only to licensed Chinese merchants. And for years, that's how it operated. There was a little community of foreign merchants in Canton that had to accept the Chinese system. And then in the 1820s, the British realized that they could make huge profits by exploiting the growing addiction of many Chinese people to opium. And opium could be grown legally in India, which was occupied by the British, and then smuggled into China, where its use and sale were illegal, but where people were so addicted that they didn't care. So by 1836, the aggressive goal of the British merchants in Canton was an independent British colony in China. And of course, spurred on by economic motives, the merchants pressured the British government, to take decisive action and to enlist the support of other British manufacturers who also wanted vast Chinese markets to be opened. Around this time, of course, the Qing government decided that the opium trade was ruining the people, and not only that, but it was stripping the empire of its silver, which was pretty much going to British merchants to pay for the opium. So the government began to prosecute Chinese drug dealers and to seize opium stores of the British merchants. And the merchants then withdrew to the barren island of Hong Kong. And so, of course, the British merchants were wealthy and they were well connected. So they appealed to their allies in London for support and the support of the British government, which wanted free, unregulated trade with China. And so the government responded, and they sent troops from India, and of course were in control of the seas at the time. And so Britain forced China into accepting the Treaty of Nanking, or Nanqing, I'm not sure. But the Chinese lost, so they had to accept this treaty. And this was 1842. And the treaty said that China would give up Hong Kong to the British, that they would pay an indemnity of $100 million, and they would open up 4 large cities to unlimited foreign trade with low tariffs. And so this caused great bitterness in China, and disputes over trade between China and the Western powers continued, ultimately leading to the occupation of Beijing by 17,000 British and French troops, and then another round of harsh treaties that forced the Chinese to accept trade and investment on unfavorable terms for several more cities. Japan and the U.S. So Japan had its own highly distinctive civilization and even less use for Westerners than the Chinese. By 1640, the Japanese government had sealed off the country from all European influences. And, this unbending isolation seemed really barbaric and even hostile to the West, particularly to the United States. And, the Americans shared the self-confidence of a powerful, expanding Western society and felt that it was their duty to force the Japanese to share their ports and to behave as, quote, a civilized nation. And so the Americans made several attempts to establish commercial relations, all of which were unsuccessful. And so Commodore Matthew Perry took a steamship into Edo, which is now Tokyo, in 1853 to basically force Japan to trade with us. So, of course, he relied on gunboat diplomacy and threatened the Japanese with an attack. And Perry demanded diplomatic negotiations with the emperor. And they saw quickly how defenseless their cities were against naval bombardment. And so they reluctantly agreed to sign a treaty with the U.S. that opened 2 ports and permitted trade. And over the next 5 years, more treaties were signed that spelled out the rights and privileges of the Western nations and their merchants in Japan. So that brings us to Western penetration of Egypt. So European involvement in Egypt, which led to a new model of formal political control, really illustrates the explosive power of the expanding European economy and society. So to backtrack a little bit, since 525 BCE, Egypt had been ruled mostly by foreigners, and most recently they had been ruled by the Ottoman Turks. And so the first appointed governor of Egypt in 1805 by the Turkish Sultan was Muhammad Ali. And Muhammad Ali wanted to build his own state, and he was going to do so on the strength of a large, powerful army. And he wanted his army to be organized along European lines. And so he also reformed the government, had new lands cultivated, wanted to improve communications. And by the end of his reign, Muhammad Ali had established a strong and almost independent Egyptian state. And so his policies of modernization attracted many Europeans to the banks of the Nile. And to pay for all of this, he encouraged the development of commercial agriculture. And so, faced with the possibility of export agriculture, high-ranking officials and members of Ali's family began to carve out large private land holdings out of the state domain. And to work these large private land holdings, they made the peasants their tenants and forced them to grow cash crops like cotton and rice. And this tradition continued under the leadership of Muhammad Ali's grandson, Ishmael. And, Ishmael was educated at France's leading military academy, and he was a westernizing autocrat who promoted large irrigation works, which actually caused cotton production and exports to Europe to boom. And he supported the completion of the Suez Canal in 1869. And of course, the Suez Canal would connect the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. On top of this, Ishmael encouraged young Egyptians to go to Europe for their education, bring back new skills. And he wanted to build modern boulevards and Western hotels in Cairo. But he was impatient and he was reckless, and he modernized, but Ishmael had amassed an enormous national debt by 1876. And people were beginning to ask, where's my money? So France and Great Britain intervened on behalf of these foreign bondholders who wanted their money and forced Ishmael to appoint French and British commissioners to oversee Egyptian finances. And so this foreign financial control evoked a violent nationalistic reaction among Egyptian religious leaders, also intellectuals and army officers, who in 1879 formed the Egyptian Nationalist Party under the leadership of Colonel Ahmed Arabi. because they were, of course, angry about French and British financial advisors in the Egyptian government. And so there were bloody anti-European riots in 1882 that provoked the British to bombard Alexandria. Of course, that resulted in more riots and a revolt led by Colonel Arabi. But the rebellion was ultimately put down by the British forces that subsequently occupied all of Egypt. And so the British claimed that their occupation was temporary, but British armies remained in Egypt until 1956. So even though the Egyptians didn't just love the British being there, the British rule did result in tax reforms, better conditions for peasants, and the foreign bondholders received their interest, and all was well, even though Egyptian nationalists were, I guess their pride was injured. Okay, so that brings our video discussion to a close, and we will pick up in the next video with the Great Migration.